Picking up on page 77, chapter 4, technically. Today is Eddie's birthday. The cake reads, "Good luck, fight hard." And on the side, along the vanilla frosted edge, someone has added the words, "Come home soon," in blue squiggly letters. But the OON is squeezed together so it reads more like son or come home son. Eddie's mother has already cleaned and pressed the clothes he will wear the next day. She hung them on a hanger in his bedroom closet and put one pair of dress shoes beneath them. Eddie is in the kitchen fooling with his young Romanian cousins, his hands behind his back as they try to punch his stomach. One points out the kitchen window at the Parisian carousel, which is lit for the evening customers. "Horses," the child exclaims. The front door opens and Eddie hears a voice that makes his heart jump, even now. He wonders if this is a weakness he shouldn't be taking off to war. "Hiya, Eddie," Marguerite says. And there she is, in the kitchen doorway, looking wonderful, and Eddie feels that familiar tickle in his chest. She brushes a bit of rainwater from her hair and smiles. She has a small box in her hands. "I brought you something for your birthday and, well, for your leaving, too." She smiles again, and Eddie wants to hug her so badly he thinks he'll burst. He doesn't care what is in the box. He only wants to remember her holding it out for him. As always, with Marguerite, Eddie mostly wants to freeze time. "This is swell," he says. She laughs. "You haven't even opened it yet." "Listen," he moves closer. Eddie," someone yells from the other room. "Come on and blow out the candles." "Yeah, we're hungry." "Oh, Sal, shush." "Well, we are." There is cake and beer and milk and cigars and a toast to Eddie's success. And there is a moment where his mother begins to cry and she hugs her other son, Joe, who is staying stateside on account of his flat feet. Later that night, Eddie walks Marguerite along the promenade. He knows the names of every ticket taker and food vendor, and they all wish him luck. Some of the older women get teary-eyed, and Eddie figures they have sons of their own, already gone. He and Marguerite buy saltwater taffy, molasses and tea berry, and root beer flavors. They pick out pieces from the small white bag, playfully fighting each other's fingers. At the penny arcade, Eddie pulls on a plaster hand, and the arrow goes past clammy and harmless and mild, all the way to hot stuff. "You're really strong," Marguerite says. "Hot stuff," Eddie says, making a muscle. At the end of the night, they stand on the boardwalk in a fashion they have seen in the movies, holding hands and leaning against the railing. Out on the sand, an old rag picker has built a small fire from sticks and torn towels and is huddling by it, settled in for the night. "You don't have to ask me to wait," Marguerite says suddenly. Eddie swallows. I don't." She shakes her head. Eddie smiles. Saved from a question that has caught in his throat all night, he feels as if a string has just shot from his heart and looped around her shoulders, pulling her close and making her his. He loves her more in this moment than he thought he could ever love anyone. A drop of rain hits Eddie's forehead, then another. He looks up at the gathering clouds. "Hey, hot stuff?" Marguerite says. She smiles, but then her face droops and she blinks back water, although Eddie cannot tell if it's raindrops or tears. "Don't get killed, okay?" she says. A freed soldier is often furious. The days and nights he lost, the torture and humiliation he suffered, it all demands a fierce revenge, a balancing of the accounts. So when Morton, his arms full of stolen weapons, said to the others, "Let's burn it down," there was a quick if not logical agreement. Inflated by their new sense of control, the men scattered with the enemy's firepower, Smitty to the entrance of the mine shaft, Morton and Eddie to the oil barrels. The captain went in search of a transport vehicle. "5 minutes, then back here," he barked. "That bombing's going to start soon and we need to be gone. Got it? 5 minutes." Which was all it took to destroy what had been their home for nearly half a year. Smitty dropped the grenades down the mine shaft and ran. Eddie and Morton rolled 2 barrels into the hut complex, pried them open, then one by one fired the nozzles of their newly acquired flamethrowers and watched the huts ignite. "Burn," Morton yelled. "Burn," Eddie yelled. The mine shaft exploded from below. Black smoke rose from the entrance. Smitty, his work done, ran toward the meeting point. Morton kicked his oil barrel into a hut and unleashed a rope-like burst of flame. Eddie watched, sneered, then moved down the path to the final hut. It was larger, more like a barn, and he lifted his weapon. This was over, he said to himself. Over. All these weeks and months in the hands of those bastards, those subhuman guards with their bad teeth and bony faces and the dead hornets in their soup. He didn't know what would happen to them next, but it could not be any worse than what they had endured. Eddie squeezed the trigger. Whoosh! The fire shot up quickly. The bamboo was dry, and within a minute, the walls of the barn were melting in orange and yellow flames. Off in the distance, Eddie heard the rumble of an engine. The captain, he hoped, had found something to escape in. And then suddenly from the skies, the first sounds of bombing, the noise they had been hearing every night. It was even closer now, and Eddie realized whoever it was would see the flames. They might be rescued. He might be going home. He turned to the burning barn and, what was that? He blinked. What was that? Something darted across the door opening. Eddie tried to focus. The heat was intense, and he shielded his eyes with his free hand. He couldn't be sure, but he thought he'd just seen a small figure running inside the fire. Hey, Eddie yelled, stepping forward, lowering his weapon. Hey! The roof of the barn began to crumble, sparkling flat, splashing sparks and flame. Eddie jumped back. His eyes watered. Maybe it was a shadow. Eddie, now! Morton was up the path, waving for Eddie to come. Eddie's eyes were stinging. He was breathing hard. He pointed and yelled, I think there's someone in there. Morton put a hand to his ears. What? Someone in there. Morton shook his head. He couldn't hear. Eddie turned and was almost certain he saw it again. There, crawling inside the burning barn, a child-sized figure. It had been more than 2 years since Eddie had seen anything besides grown men, and the shadowy shape made him think suddenly of his small cousins back at the pier, and the little folks' miniature railway he used to run, and the roller coasters, and the kids on the beach, and Marguerite, and her picture, and all that he'd shut from his mind for so many months. Hey, come out, he yelled, dropping the flamethrower, moving in even closer. I won't shoot. A hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him backward. Eddie spun, his fist clenched. It was Morton yelling, Eddie, we gotta go, now. Eddie shook his head. No, wait. I think there's someone there's nobody in there, now. Eddie was desperate. He turned back to the barn. Morton grabbed him again. This time Eddie spun around and swung wildly, hitting him in the chest. Morton fell to his knees. Eddie's head was pounding, his face twisted in anger. He turned again to the flames, his eyes nearly shut. There. What was it? Rolling behind a wall. There. He stepped forward, convinced something innocent was being burned to death in front of him. Then the rest of the roof collapsed with a roar, casting sparks like electric dust that rained down on his head. In that instant, the whole of the war came surging out of him like bile. He was sickened by the captivity and sickened by the murders, sickened by the blood and goo drying on his temples, sickened by the bombing and the burning and the futility of it all. At that moment, he just wanted to salvage something, a piece of Rebozo, a piece of himself, something. And he staggered into the flaming wreckage, madly convinced that there was a soul inside every black shadow. Planes roared overhead, and shots from their guns rang out in drum beats. Eddie moved as if in a trance. He stepped past a burning puddle of oil, and his clothes caught fire from behind. A yellow flame moved up his calf and thigh. He raised his arms and hollered, I'll help you. Come out. I won't A piercing pain ripped through Eddie's leg. He screamed a long, hard curse, then crumpled to the ground. Blood was spewing below his knee. Plane engines roared. The skies lit in bluish flashes. He lay there bleeding and burning, his eyes shut against the searing heat. And for the first time in his life, he felt ready to die. Then someone yanked him backward, rolling him in the dirt, extinguishing the flames, and he was too stunned and weak to resist. He rolled like a sack of beans. Soon he was inside a transport vehicle, and the others were around him, telling him to hang on, hang on. His back was burned, and his knee had gone numb, and he was getting dizzy and tired. So very tired. The captain nodded slowly as he recalled those last moments. You remember anything about how you got out of there? He asked. Not really, Eddie said. Took 2 days. You were in and out of consciousness. You lost a lot of blood. We made it, though, Eddie said. Yeah. The captain drew the word out, punctuated it with a sigh. That bullet got you pretty good. In truth, the bullet had never been fully removed. It had cut through several nerves and tendons and shattered against a bone, fracturing it vertically. Eddie had had 2 surgeries. Neither cured the problem. The doctor said he'd be left with a limp, one likely to get worse with age as the misshapen bones deteriorated. The best we can do, he was told. Was it? Who could say? All Eddie knew that he'd awoken in a medical unit and his life was never the same. His running was over. His dancing was over. Worse, for some reason, the way he used to feel about things was over too. He withdrew. Things seemed silly or pointless. War had crawled inside of Eddie, in his leg and in his soul. He learned many things as a soldier. He came home a different man. Did you know, the captain said, that I come from 3 generations of military? Eddie shrugged. Yep. I knew how to fire a pistol when I was 6. In the mornings, my father would inspect my bed, actually bounce a quarter on the sheets. At the dinner table, it was always, yes, sir, and no, sir. Before I entered the service, all I ever did was take orders. Next thing I knew, I was giving them. Peacetime was one thing. Got a lot of wise guy recruits. But then the war started and the new men flooded in. Young men, like you. And they were all saluting me. Wanting me to tell them what to do. I could see the fear in their eyes. They acted as if I knew something about war that was classified. They thought I could keep them alive. You did too, didn't you? Eddie had to admit that he did. The captain reached back and rubbed his neck. I couldn't, of course. I took my orders too, but if I couldn't keep you alive, I thought I could at least keep you together. In the middle of a big war, you go looking for a small idea to believe in. When you find one, you hold it the way a soldier holds his crucifix when he's praying in a foxhole. For me, that little idea was that I told you guys every day, no one gets left behind. Eddie nodded. That meant a lot, he said. The captain looked straight at him. I hope so, he said. He reached inside his breast pocket, took out another cigarette, and lit up. Why do you say that? Eddie asked. The captain blew smoke, then motioned with the end of the cigarette towards Eddie's leg. Because I was the one, he said, who shot you. Eddie looked at his leg, dangling over the tree branch. The surgery scars were back, and so was the pain. He felt a welling of something inside him that he had not felt since before he died. In truth, that he had not felt in many years. A fierce, surging flood of anger and a desire to hurt something. His eyes narrowed and he stared at the captain, who stared back blankly, as if he knew what was coming. He let the cigarette fall from his fingers. Go ahead, he whispered. Eddie screamed and lunged with a windmill swing, and the 2 men fell off the tree branch and tumbled through limbs and vines, wrestling and falling all the way down. Why, you bastard, not you, why? They were grappling now on the muddy earth. Eddie straddled the captain's chest, pummeling him with blows to the face. The captain did not bleed. Eddie shook him by the collar and banged his skull against the mud. The captain did not blink. Instead, he rolled from side to side with each punch, allowing Eddie his rage. Finally, with one arm, he grabbed Eddie and flipped him over. Because, he said calmly, his elbow across Eddie's chest, we would have lost you in that fire. You would have died, and it wasn't your time. Eddie panted hard. My time? The captain continued. You were obsessed with getting in there. You damn near knocked Morton out when he tried to stop you. We had a minute to get out, and damn your strength, you were too tough to fight. Eddie felt a final surge of rage and grabbed the captain by the collar. He pulled him close. He saw the teeth stained yellow by tobacco. My leg, Eddie seethed. My life. I took your leg, the captain said quietly, to save your life. Eddie let go and fell back exhausted. His arms ached. His head was spinning. For so many years, he had been haunted by that one moment, that one mistake, when his whole life changed. There was nobody in that hut. What was I thinking? If only I didn't go in there. His voice dropped to a whisper. Why didn't I just die? No one gets left behind, remember? The captain said. What happened to you? I've seen it happen before. A soldier reaches a certain point and then he can't go anymore. Sometimes it's in the middle of the night. A man will just roll out of his tent and start walking barefoot, half naked, like he's going home, like he lives just around the corner. Sometimes it's in the middle of a fight. Man will drop his gun and his eyes go blank. He's just done. Can't fight anymore. Usually he gets shot. Your case, it just so happened, you snapped in front of a fire about a minute before we were done with this place. I couldn't let you burn alive. I figured a leg wound would heal. We pulled you out of there and the others got you to a medical unit. Eddie's breathing smacked like a hammer in his chest. His head was smeared with mud and leaves. It took him a minute to realize the last thing the captain had said. The others? Eddie said. What do you mean, the others? The captain rose. He brushed a twig from his leg. Did you ever see me again? He asked. Eddie had not. He had been airlifted to the military hospital and eventually, because of his handicap, was discharged and flown home to America. He had heard months later that the captain had not made it, but he figured it was some later combat with some other unit. A letter arrived eventually with a medal inside, but Eddie put it away, unopened. The months after the war were dark and brooding, and he forgot details and had no interest in collecting them. In time, he changed his address. It's like I told you, the captain said. Tetanus? Yellow fever? All those shots? Just a big waste of my time. He nodded in a direction over Eddie's shoulder, and Eddie turned to look. What he saw suddenly was no longer the barren hills, but the night of their escape. The hazy moon in the sky, the planes coming in, the huts on fire. The captain was driving the transport with Smitty, Morton, and Eddie inside. Eddie was across the back seat, burned, wounded, semi-conscious, as Morton tied a tourniquet above his knee. The shelling was getting closer. The black sky lit up every few seconds, as if the sun were flickering on and off. The transport swerved as it reached the top of a hill, then stopped. There was a gate, a makeshift thing of wood and wire, but because the ground dropped off sharply on both sides, they could not go around it. The captain grabbed a rifle and jumped out. He shot the lock and pushed the gate open. He motioned for Morton to take the wheel, then pointed to his eyes, signaling he would check the path ahead, which curled into a thicket of trees. He ran as best he could in his bare feet, 50 yards beyond the turn in the road. The path was clear. He waved to his men. A plane zoomed overhead, and he lifted his eyes to see whose side it was. It was at that moment, while he was looking to the heavens, that a small click sounded beneath his right foot. The landmine exploded instantly, like a burping flame from the Earth's core. It blew the captain 20 feet into the air and split him into pieces, one fiery lump of bone and gristle, and 100 chunks of charred flesh, some of which flew over the muddy earth and landed in the banyan trees. The second lesson. Oh, Jesus, Eddie said, closing his eyes and dropping his head backward. Oh, God, oh, God. I had no idea, sir. It's sick. It's awful. The captain nodded and looked away. The hills had returned to their barren state, the animal bones and the broken cart and the smoldering remains of the village. Eddie realized this was the captain's burial ground. No funeral, no coffin, just his shattered skeleton in the muddy earth. You've been waiting here all this time? Eddie whispered. Time, the captain said. It's not what you think. He sat down next to Eddie. Dying? Not the end of everything. We think it is. But what happens on Earth is only the beginning. Eddie looked lost. I figure it's like in the Bible. The Adam and Eve deal? The captain said. Adam's first night on Earth, when he lays down to sleep, he thinks it's all over, right? Doesn't know what sleep is. His eyes are closing and he thinks he's leaving this world, right? Only he isn't. He wakes up the next morning and he has a fresh new world to work with. But he has something else, too. He has his yesterday. The captain grinned. The way I see it, that's what we're getting here, soldier. That's what heaven is. You get to make sense of your yesterdays. He took out his plastic cigarette pack and tapped it with his finger. You following this? I was never all that hot at teaching. Eddie watched the captain closely. He'd always thought of him as so much older, but now, with some of the coal ash rubbed from his face, Eddie noticed the scant lines on his skin and the full head of dark hair. He must have been only in his 30s. You been here since you died? Eddie said. But that's twice as long as you lived. The captain nodded. Been waiting for you. Eddie looked down. Yeah, that's what the blue man said. Well, he was too. He was part of your life, part of why you lived and how you lived, part of the story you needed to know. But he told you and he's beyond here now, and in a short bit, I'm going to be as well. So listen up, because here's what you need to know from me. Eddie felt his back straighten. Sacrifice, the captain said. You made one. I made one. We all make 'em. But you were angry over yours. You kept thinking about what you lost. You didn't get it. Sacrifice is a part of life. It's supposed to be. It's not something to regret. It's something to aspire to. Little sacrifices, big sacrifices. A mother works so her son can go to school. A daughter moves home to take care of her sick father. A man goes to war. He stopped for a moment and looked off into the cloudy gray sky. Rebozo didn't die for nothing, you know. He sacrificed for his country, and his family knew it. And his kid brother went on to be a good soldier and a great man because he was inspired by it. I didn't die for nothing either. That night, we might have all driven over that landmine. Then the four of us would have been gone. Eddie shook his head. But you, he lowered his voice, you lost your life. The captain smacked his tongue on his teeth. That's the thing. Sometimes when you sacrifice something precious, you're not really losing it. You're just passing it on to someone else. The captain walked over to the helmet, rifle, and dog tags, the symbolic graves still stuck in the ground. He placed the helmet and tags under one arm, then plucked the rifle from the mud and threw it like a javelin. It never landed, just soared into the sky and disappeared. The captain turned. I shot you all right, he said, and you lost something, but you gained something as well. You just didn't know it yet. I gained something too. What? I got to keep my promise. I didn't leave you behind. He held out his palm. Forgive me about the leg? Eddie thought for a moment. He thought about the bitterness after his wounding, his anger at all he had given up. Then he thought of what the captain had given up, and he felt ashamed. He offered his hand. The captain gripped it tightly. That's what I've been waiting for. Suddenly, the thick vines dropped off the banyan branches and melted with a hiss into the ground. New, healthy branches emerged in a yawning spread, covered in smooth, leathery leaves and pouches of figs. The captain only glanced up, as if he'd been expecting it. Then, using his open palms, he wiped the remaining ash from his face. Captain? Eddie said. Yeah? Why here? You can pick anywhere to wait, right? That's what the blue man said, so why this place? The captain smiled. Because I died in battle. I was killed in these hills. I left the world having known almost nothing but war. War talk, war plans, war family. My wish was to see what the world looked like without a war, before we started killing each other. Eddie looked around. But this is war. To you. But our eyes are different, the captain said. What you see ain't what I see. He lifted a hand and the smoldering landscape transformed. The rubble melted, trees grew and spread. The ground turned from mud to lush green grass. The murky clouds pulled apart like curtains, revealing a sapphire sky. A light white mist fell in above the treetops, and a peach-colored sun hung brilliantly above the horizon, reflected in the sparkling oceans that now surrounded the island. It was pure, unspoiled, untouched beauty. Eddie looked up at his old commanding officer, whose face was clean and whose uniform was suddenly pressed. This, the captain said, raising his arms, is what I see. He stood for a moment, taking it in. By the way, I don't smoke anymore. That was all in your eyes, too. He chuckled. Why would I smoke in heaven? He began to walk off. Wait, Eddie yelled. I gotta know something. My death at the pier. Did I save that girl? I felt her hands, but I can't remember. The captain turned, and Eddie swallowed his words, embarrassed to even be asking, given the horrible way the captain had died. I just want to know, that's all, he mumbled. The captain scratched behind his ear. He looked at Eddie sympathetically. Can't tell you, soldier. Eddie dropped his head. But someone can. He tossed the helmet and tags. Yours. Eddie looked down. Inside the helmet flap was a crumpled photo of a woman that made his heart ache all over again. When he looked up, the captain was gone. Monday, 7:30 a.m. So back in the present on Earth after Eddie's death. The morning after the accident, Dominguez came to the shop early, skipping his routine of picking up a bagel and a soft drink for breakfast. The park was closed, but he came in anyhow, and he turned on the water at the sink. He ran his hands under the flow, thinking he would clean some of the ride parts. Then he shut off the water and abandoned the idea. It seemed twice as quiet as it had a minute ago. What's up? Willie was at the shop door. He wore a green tank top and baggy jeans. He held a newspaper. The headline read, Amusement Park Tragedy. Hard time sleeping, Dominguez said. Yeah, Eddie slumped onto a metal stool. Me too. He spun a half circle on the stool, looking blankly at the paper. When do you think they'll open us up again? Dominguez shrugged. Ask the police. They sat quietly for a while, shifting their postures as if taking turns. Dominguez sighed. Willie reached inside his shirt pocket, fishing for a stick of gum. It was Monday. It was morning. They were waiting for the old man to come in and get the workday started. The third person Eddie meets in heaven. A sudden wind lifted Eddie, and he spun like a pocket watch on the end of a chain. An explosion of smoke engulfed him, swallowing his body in a flume of colors. The sky seemed to pull in until he could feel it touching his skin like a gathered blanket. Then it shot away and exploded into jade. Stars appeared, millions of stars like salt sprinkled across the greenish firmament. Eddie blinked. He was in the mountains now, but the most remarkable mountains, a range that went on forever, with snow-capped peaks, jagged rocks, and sheer purple slopes. In a flat between two crests was a large black lake. A moon reflected brightly in its water. Down the ridge, Eddie noticed a flickering of colored light that changed rhythmically every few seconds. He stepped in that direction and realized he was ankle-deep in snow. He lifted his foot and shook it hard. The flakes fell loose and glistening with a golden sheen. When he touched them, they were neither cold nor wet. Where am I now? Eddie thought. Once again, he took stock of his body, pressing on his shoulders, his chest, his stomach. His arm muscles remained tight, but his midsection was looser, flabbier. He hesitated, then squeezed his left knee. It throbbed in pain, and Eddie winced. He had hoped upon leaving the captain that that the wound would disappear. Instead, it seemed he was becoming the man he'd been on Earth, scars and fat and all. Why would heaven make you relive your own decay? He followed the flickering lights down the narrow ridge. This landscape, stark and silent, was breathtaking, more like how he'd imagined heaven. He wondered for a moment if he had somehow finished, if the captain had been wrong, if there were no more people to meet. He came through the snow around a rock ledge to the large clearing from which the lights originated. He blinked again, this time in disbelief. There, in the snowy field, sitting by itself, was a boxcar-shaped building with a stainless steel exterior and a red barrel roof. A sign above it blinked the word, Eat. A diner. Eddie had spent many hours in places like this. They all looked the same. High-backed booths, shiny countertops, a row of small-paned windows across the front, which from the outside made customers appear like riders in a railroad car. Eddie could make out figures through those windows now, people talking and gesturing. He walked up the snowy steps to the double-paned door. He peered inside. An elderly couple was sitting to his right, eating pie. They took no notice of him. Other customers sat in swivel chairs at the marble counter or inside booths with their coats on hooks. They appeared to be from different decades. Eddie saw a woman with a 1930s high-collared dress and a long-haired young man with a 1960s peace sign tattooed on his arm. Many of the patrons appeared to have been wounded. A black man in a work shirt was missing an arm. A teenage girl had a deep gash across her face. None of them looked over when Eddie rapped on the window. He saw cooks wearing white paper hats and plates of steaming food on the counter awaiting serving. Food in the most succulent colors, deep red sauces, yellow buttercreams. His eyes moved along to the last booth in the right-hand corner, and he froze. What he saw, he could not have seen. No, he heard himself whisper. He turned back from the door. He drew deep breaths. His heart pounded. He spun around and looked again, then banged wildly on the window panes. No, Eddie yelled. No, no. He banged until he was sure the glass would break. No! He kept yelling until the word he wanted, a word he hadn't spoken in decades, finally formed in his throat. He screamed that word then. He screamed it so loudly that his head throbbed, but the figure inside the booth remained hunched over, oblivious, one hand resting on the table, the other holding a cigar, never looking up, no matter how many times Eddie howled it, over and over again. Dad! 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 Today is Eddie's birthday. In the dim and sterile hallway of the VA hospital, Eddie's mother opens the white bakery box and rearranges the candles on the cake, making them even, 12 on one side, 12 on the other. The rest of them, Eddie's father, Joe, Marguerite, Mickey Shea stand around her watching. Does anyone have a match? She whispers. They pat their pockets. Mickey fishes a pack from his jacket, dropping 2 loose cigarettes on the floor. Eddie's mother lights the candles. An elevator pings down the hall. A gurney emerges. All right, then, let's go, she says. The small flames wiggle as they move together. The group enters Eddie's room, softly singing, Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to... The soldier in the next bed wakes up yelling, What the hell? He realizes where he is and drops back down, embarrassed. The song, once interrupted, seems too heavy to lift again, and only Eddie's mother's voice, shaking in its solitude, is able to continue. Happy birthday, dear Eddie. Then quickly, Happy birthday to you. Eddie props himself against a pillow. His burns are bandaged. His leg is in a long cast. There is a pair of crutches by the bed. He looks at these faces, and he's consumed by a desire to run away. Joe clears his throat. Well, hey, you look pretty good, he says. The others quickly agree. Good. Yes, very good. Your mom got a cake, Marguerite whispers. Eddie's mother steps forward as if it's her turn. She presents the cardboard box. Eddie mumbles, Thanks, Ma. She looks around. Now where should we put this? Mickey grabs a chair. Joe clears a small tabletop. Marguerite moves Eddie's crutches. Only his father does not shuffle for the sake of shuffling. He stands against the back wall, a jacket over his arm, staring at Eddie's leg, encased in plaster from thigh to ankle. Eddie catches his eye. His father looks down and runs his hand over the windowsill. Eddie tightens every muscle in his body and attempts, by sheer will, to force the tears back into their ducts. All parents damage their children. It cannot be helped. Youth, like pristine glass, absorbs the prints of its handlers. Some parents smudge, others crack, a few shatter childhoods completely into jagged little pieces beyond repair. The damage done by Eddie's father was, at the beginning, the damage of neglect. As an infant, Eddie was rarely held by the man, and as a child, he was mostly grabbed by the arm, less with love than annoyance. Eddie's mother handed out the tenderness. His father was there for the discipline. On Saturdays, Eddie's father took him to the pier. Eddie would leave the apartment with visions of carousels and globs of cotton candy, but after an hour or so, his father would find a familiar face and say, Watch the kid for me, will ya? Until his father returned, usually late in the afternoon, often drunk. Eddie stayed in the custody of an acrobat or an animal trainer. Still, for countless hours of his boardwalk youth, Eddie waited for his father's attention, sitting on railings or squatting in his short pants atop tool chests in the repair shop. Often he'd say, I can help, but the only job entrusted him was crawling beneath the Ferris wheel in the morning before the park opened to collect the coins that had fallen from customers' pockets the night before. At least 4 evenings a week, his father played cards. The table had money, bottles, cigarettes, and rules. Eddie's rule was simple, do not disturb. Once he tried to stand next to his father and look at his cards, but the old man put down his cigar and erupted like thunder, smacking Eddie's face with the back of his hand. Stop breathing on me, he said. Eddie burst into tears and his mother pulled him to her waist, glaring at her husband. Eddie never got that close again. Other nights, when the cards went bad and the bottles had been emptied and his mother was already asleep, his father brought his thunder into Eddie and Joe's bedroom. He raked through the meager toys, hurling them against the wall. Then he made his sons lie face down on the mattress while he pulled off his belt and lashed their rear ends, screaming that they were wasting his money on junk. Eddie used to pray for his mother to wake up, but even the times she did, his father warned her to stay out of it. Seeing her in the hallway clutching her robe, as helpless as he was, made it all even worse. The hands on Eddie's childhood glass then were hard and calloused and red with anger, and he went through his younger years whacked, lashed, and beaten. This was the second damage done, the one after neglect, the damage of violence. It got so that Eddie could tell by the thump of the footsteps coming down the hall how hard he was going to get it. Through it all, despite it all, Eddie privately adored his old man, because sons will adore their fathers through even the worst behavior. It was how they learned devotion. But before he can devote himself to God or a woman, a boy will devote himself to his father, even foolishly, even beyond explanation. And on occasion, as if to feed the weakest embers of a fire, Eddie's father let a wrinkle of pride crack through the veneer of his disinterest. At the baseball field by the 14th Avenue schoolyard, his father stood behind the fence watching Eddie play. If Eddie smacked the ball to the outfield, his father nodded, and when he did, Eddie leaped around the bases. Other times, when Eddie came home from an alley fight, his father would notice his scraped knuckles or split lip. He would ask, "What happened to the other guy?" And Eddie would say he got him good. This, too, met with his father's approval. When Eddie attacked the kids who were bothering his brother, the hoodlums, his mother called them, Joe was ashamed and hid in his room. But Eddie's father said, "Never mind him. You're the strong one. You be your brother's keeper. Don't let nobody touch him." When Eddie started junior high, he mimicked his father's summer schedule, rising before the sun, working at the park until nightfall. At first, he ran the simpler rides, maneuvering the brake levers, bringing train cars to a gentle stop. In later years, he worked in the repair shop. Eddie's father would test him with maintenance problems. He'd hand him a broken steering wheel and say, "Fix it." He'd point out a tangled chain and say, "Fix it." He'd carry over a rusty fender and sandpaper and say, "Fix it." And every time, upon completion of the task, Eddie would walk the item back to his father and say, "It's fixed." At night, they would gather at the dinner table, his mother plump and sweating, cooking by the stove, his brother Joe talking away, his hair and skin smelling from seawater. Joe had become a good swimmer, and his summer work was at the Ruby Pier pool. Joe talked about all the people he saw there, their swimsuits, their money. Eddie's father was not impressed. Once Eddie overheard him talking to his mother about Joe. "That one," he said, "ain't tough enough for anything but water." Still, Eddie envied the way his brother looked in the evening, so tan and clean. Eddie's fingernails, like his father's, were stained with grease, and at the dinner table, Eddie would flick through them with his thumbnail, trying to get the dirt out. He caught his father watching him once, and the old man grinned. "Shows you did a hard day's work," he said, and he held up his own dirty fingernails before wrapping them around a glass of beer. By this point, already a strapping teenager, Eddie only nodded back. Unbeknownst to him, he had begun the ritual of semaphore with his father, forsaking words or physical affection. It was all to be done internally. You were just supposed to know it, that's all. Denial of affection. Damage done. And then, one night, the speaking stopped altogether. This was after the war, when Eddie had been released from the hospital and the cast had been removed from his leg, and he had moved back into the family apartment on Beechwood Avenue. His father had been drinking at the nearby pub, and he came home late to find Eddie asleep on the couch. The darkness of combat had left Eddie changed. He stayed indoors. He rarely spoke, even to Marguerite. He spent hours staring out the kitchen window, watching the carousel ride, rubbing his bad knee. His mother whispered that he just needed time, but his father grew more agitated each day. He didn't understand depression. To him, it was weakness. "Get up," he yelled now, his words slurring, "and get a job." Eddie stirred, and his father yelled again, "Get up! Get a job!" The old man was wobbling, but he came toward Eddie and pushed him. "Get up and get a job! Get up and get a job! Get up and get a job!" Eddie rose to his elbows. "Get up and get a job! Get up and—" "Enough!" Eddie yelled, surging to his feet, ignoring the burst of pain in his knee. He glared at his father, his face just inches away. He could smell the bad breath of alcohol and cigarettes. The old man glanced at Eddie's leg, his voice lowered to a growl. "See? You ain't so hurt." He reeled back to throw a punch, but Eddie moved on instinct and grabbed his father's arm mid-swing. The old man's eyes widened. This was the first time Eddie had ever defended himself, the first time he had ever done anything besides receive a beating as if he deserved it. His father looked at his own clenched fist, short of its mark, and his nostrils flared, and his teeth gritted, and he staggered backward and he yanked his arm free. He stared at Eddie with the eyes of a man watching a train pull away, and he never spoke to his son again. This was the final handprint on Eddie's glass. Silence. It haunted their remaining years. His father was silent when Eddie moved into his own apartment. Silent when Eddie took a cab driving job. Silent at Eddie's wedding. Silent when Eddie came to visit his mother. She begged and wept and beseeched her husband to change his mind, to let it go. But Eddie's father would only say to her through a closed jaw what he said to the others who made the same request. "That boy raised a hand to me." And that was the end of the conversation. All parents damaged their children. This was their life together. Neglect, violence, silence. And now, someplace beyond death, Eddie slumped against a stainless steel wall and dropped into a snowbank, stung again by the denial of a man whose love, almost inexplicably, he still coveted. A man ignoring him, even in heaven. His father. The damage done. "Don't be angry," a woman's voice said. "He can't hear you." Eddie jerked his head up. An old woman stood before him in the snow. Her face was gaunt with sagging cheeks, rose-colored lipstick, and tightly pulled back white hair, thin enough in parts to reveal the pink scalp beneath it. She wore wire-rimmed spectacles over narrow blue eyes. Eddie could not recall her. Her clothes were before his time, a dress made of silk and chiffon with a bib-like bodice stitched with white beads and topped with a velvet bow just below her neck. Her skirt had a rhinestone buckle, and there were snaps and hooks up the side. She stood with elegant posture, holding a parasol with both hands. Eddie guessed she'd been rich. "Not always rich," she said, grinning as if she'd heard him. "I was raised much like you were in the back end of the city, forced to leave school when I was 14. I was a working girl. So were my sisters. We gave every nickel back to the family." Eddie interrupted. He didn't want another story. "Why can't my father hear me?" he demanded. She smiled. "Because his spirit, safe and sound, is part of my eternity, but he is not really here. You are. Why does my father have to be safe for you?" She paused. "Come," she said. Suddenly they were at the bottom of the mountain. The light from the diner was now just a speck like a star that had fallen into a crevice. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the old woman said. Eddie followed her eyes. There was something about her as if he'd seen her photograph somewhere. "Are you my third person?" "I am at that," she said. Eddie rubbed his head. Who was this woman? At least with the blue man, at least with the captain, he had some recollection of their place in his life. Why a stranger? Why now? Eddie had once hoped death would mean a reunion with those who went before him. He had attended so many funerals, polishing his black dress shoes, finding his hat, standing in a cemetery with the same despairing question. Why are they all gone and I'm still here? His mother, his brother, his aunts and uncles, his buddy Noel, Marguerite. One day, the priest would say, we will all be together in the kingdom of heaven. Where were they then, if this was his heaven? Eddie studied this strange older woman. He felt more alone than ever. "Can I see Earth?" he whispered. She shook her head no. "Can I talk to God?" "You can always do that." He hesitated before asking the next question. "Can I go back?" She squinted. "Back?" "Yeah, back," Eddie said, "to my life, to that last day. Is there something I can do? Can I promise to be good? Can I promise to go to church all the time? Something?" "Why?" She seemed amused. "Why?" Eddie repeated. He swiped at the snow that had no cold with the bare hand that felt no moisture. "Why? Because this place don't make no sense to me. Because I don't feel like no angel, if that's what I'm supposed to feel like. Because I don't feel like I got it all figured out. I can't even remember my own death. I can't remember the accident. All I remember are these two little hands, this little girl I was trying to save, see? I was pulling her out of the way and I must have grabbed her hands and that's when I—" He shrugged. "Died?" the woman said, smiling. "Passed away? Moved on? Met your maker?" "Died," he said, exhaling, "and that's all I remember. Then you, the others, all this. Ain't you supposed to have peace when you die?" "You have peace," the old woman said, "when you make it with yourself." "Nah," Eddie said, shaking his head. "Nah, you don't." He thought about telling her the agitation he'd felt every day since the war, the bad dreams, the inability to get excited about much of anything, the times he went to the docks alone and watched the fish pulled in by the wide rope nets, embarrassed because he saw himself in those helpless, flopping creatures snared and beyond escape. He didn't tell her that. Instead, he said, "No offense, lady, but I don't even know you." "But I know you," she said. Eddie sighed. "Oh, yeah? How's that?" "Well," she said, "if you have a moment." She sat down then, although there was nothing to sit on. She simply rested on the air and crossed her legs ladylike, keeping her spine straight. The long skirt folded neatly around her. A breeze blew, and Eddie caught the faint scent of perfume. "As I mentioned, I was once a working girl. My job was serving food in a place called the Seahorse Grill. It was near the ocean where you grew up. Perhaps you remember it?" She nodded toward the diner, and it all came back to Eddie. Of course, that place. He used to eat breakfast there. A greasy spoon, they called it. They'd torn it down years ago. "You?" Eddie said, almost laughing. You were a waitress at the Seahorse?" "Indeed," she said proudly. "I served dock workers their coffee and longshoremen their crab cakes and bacon. I was an attractive girl in those years, I might add. I turned away many a proposal. My sisters would scold me, "Who are you to be so choosy?" they would say. "Find a man before it's too late." Then one morning, the finest looking gentleman I had ever seen walked through the door. He wore a chalk striped suit and a derby hat. His dark hair was neatly cut, and his mustache covered a constant smile. He nodded when I served him, and I tried not to stare. But when he spoke with his colleague, I could hear his heavy, confident laughter. Twice I caught him looking in my direction. When he paid his bill, he said his name was Emile, and he asked if he might call on me. And I knew right then my sisters would no longer have to hound me for a decision. Our courtship was exhilarating, for Emile was a man of means. He took me places I had never been, bought me clothes I had never imagined, paid for meals I had never experienced in my poor sheltered life. Emile had earned his wealth quickly from investments in lumber and steel. He was a spender, a risk taker. He went over the boards when he got an idea. I suppose that is why he was drawn to a poor girl like me. He abhorred those who were born into wealth, and rather enjoyed doing things the sophisticated people would never do. One of those things was visiting seaside resorts. He loved the attractions, the salty food, the gypsies and fortune tellers and weight guessers and diving girls, and we both loved the sea. One day, as we sat in the sand, the tide rolling gently over our feet, he asked for my hand in marriage. I was overjoyed. I told him yes, and we went and we heard the sounds of children playing in the ocean. Emile went over the boards again and swore that soon he would build a resort park just for me, to capture the happiness of this moment, to stay eternally young. The old woman smiled. Emile kept his promise. A few years later, he made a deal with the railroad company, which was looking for a way to increase its riders on the weekend. That's how most amusement parks were built, you know. Eddie nodded. He did know. Most people didn't. They thought amusement parks were constructed by elves built with candy canes. In fact, they were simple business opportunities for railroad companies, who erected them at the final stop of routes, so commuters would have a reason to ride on weekends. "You know where I work?" Eddie used to say. "The end of the line. That's where I work." Emile, the old woman continued, built the most wonderful place. A massive pier using timber and steel he already owned. Then came the magical attractions, races and rides and boat trips and tiny railways. There was a carousel imported from France and a Ferris wheel from one of the international exhibitions in Germany. There were towers and spires and thousands of incandescent lights, so bright that at night you could see the park from a ship's deck on the ocean. Emile hired hundreds of workers, municipal workers and carnival workers and foreign workers. He brought in animals and acrobats and clowns. The entrance was the last thing finished, and it was truly grand. Everyone said so. When it was complete, he took me there with a cloth blindfold over my eyes. When he removed the blindfold, I saw it. The old woman took a step back from Eddie. She looked at him curiously, as if she were disappointed. "The entrance?" she said. "Don't you remember? Didn't you ever wonder about the name? Where you worked? Where your father worked?" She touched her chest softly with her white gloved fingers. Then she dipped, as if formally introducing herself. "I," she said, "am Ruby." Okay, stop there and get your next quiz.